Hello students, a very good morning to everyone. Welcome back to St. Joseph Study Center Smart Classes. This is 10th Standard, Unit 7, Prose, The Dying Detective, written by Arthur Conan Doyle. And to say about this particular writer, he lived between 1859 and 1930. And he is a British writer, best known for his detective fictions. You all might be aware of this. He introduced the character Sherlock Holmes. Generally, he is the milestone in the field of crime fiction. He wrote 46 short stories featuring the famous detective. And this particular lesson is going to be narrated by Dr. Watson. Okay, he is a doctor and he works under Sherlock Holmes. And more about the author. Originally, he is a physician the writer is a physician, in the sense a doctor. He published a book called A Study in Scarlet and the first 4 novels about Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. In addition to that, he also wrote some 50 short stories about the particular character Sherlock Holmes. And some of his notable works are Sherlock Holmes and the Lost World. Let's move into the lesson. What is actually happening here? What happened to Sherlock Holmes? Why it is given as the dying detective? The detective is none other than Sherlock Holmes himself. He is seriously ill and he wanted to meet his assistant Dr. Watson. And he asks his landlady, who is that Mrs. Hudson, to get him, and Watson was surprised to see the condition of his master. And was he able to save his master? Let's see. All the more we will be just having some 4 predominant characters. Who are they? One is Sherlock Holmes and another one Dr. Watson, Mrs. Hudson and Alberton Smith. These are the 4 major characters we will be having in this lesson. Let's see how the story begins. And so as I said, this lesson is going to be narrated by his assistant Dr. Watson. Let's see what he narrates, how the condition is. So Mrs. Hudson, the landlady of Sherlock Holmes, came to me and said, "Mr. Holmes is dying, Mr. Watson. For 3 days he has been sinking, and I doubt if he will last another day. He would not let me get a doctor. I told him I could not stand it anymore and would get a doctor. He replied, 'Let it be Watson then.' I was horrified, for I had not heard about his illness before. I rushed for my hat and coat. As we drove back, I asked her about the details." So what's happening actually? Dr. Watson didn't know anything about Sherlock Holmes' disease. For about 3 days, he didn't eat anything. He was lying just there in the bed, and Mrs. Hudson was horrified. And she struggles that he would last for another day. In the sense, not even 1 day he could cope up with his disease. He may die. That's the fear she has. And immediately Dr. Watson goes, takes the coat and hat, and then he rushes back. On the way, he gets to know about the details of his disease, where he got all those diseases. Then Mrs. Hudson slowly explains that he was working on a case down Rotherhithe. From Wednesday afternoon, he has not eaten anything. And from there, I think he would have got that disease. Because of this, he is so much suffering. And you should have called a doctor. No, that's what Dr. Watson asked. He wouldn't have it, sir. I didn't dare to disobey him. Mrs. Hudson was a little bit afraid to disobey the commands of Sherlock Holmes. And furthermore, what happens? He was indeed a sad sight. So Dr. Watson comes to the house, and there the whole place is a gloomy one, he says. Dim light of gloomy November day. November, you know how gloomy it will be. More of fog, cold, everything. And the sight of this man brought chill to his heart, he says. It brought chill to my heart. Chill in the sense not so happy. Chill in the sense so sad. His heart frozen, it seems, on the sight of this young man, Sherlock Holmes. Think of your friend. The moment you see him, he is such a good young man, he is so active, and the moment you see him on the bed, so dull, so sick. How will you feel? The same feeling Dr. Watson also has. His eyes had the brightness of the fever. His cheeks were flushed and his hand twitched all the time. In the sense, it shivered like anything. He was so ill. My dear fellow, I cried, approaching him. Stand back, he cried. But why? I want to help you. Said, certainly Watson, but it's for your own sake. For my sake, I was surprised. And this is what happens. Watson tried to help Holmes, but then Holmes says, just stand back. For your sake, just stand back. Why he has to stand back? Because that disease was a contagious one and it's a deadly one. Actually, he got that disease from Sumatra. So you have to underline in your book, Sumatra is the place. From there, he got that disease. And good heavens, Holmes, do you think it can stop me? And Dr. Watson was unstoppable. He actually liked to help Holmes. And that's why he is wishing to do some remedy. Then immediately Sherlock Holmes says, if you stand there, I'll talk. Or else you can just leave the room. That's what Sherlock Holmes says. And Dr. Watson argues, you have to understand my feelings as a doctor, no? Then at one point he just bursts out. Dr. Watson says, whether you like it or not, I'll examine your symptoms and I am really going to treat you. Then Sherlock Holmes says, if at all I have to have a doctor, then let me have in whom I have confidence. Dr. Watson was heartbroken. Then you don't have any confidence in me, he asks. Definitely, in your friendship, I have confidence. But this disease, you are just a general practitioner and thus I don't trust in you. I want a specialist and you are not a specialist. Then if so, let me bring Sir Japper Meek or Penrose Fisher. He says some of the best doctors in London. How ignorant you are, Watson. Then Holmes criticizes him again and again. Then Holmes asks Dr. Watson, what do you know about Tarpaulin fever? See, in your book it's there, just underline Tarpaulin fever, or it's called as the Black Formosa Plague. Then he admits, Dr. Watson admits, I don't know anything about that particular fever. And that's why Sherlock Holmes said, stand back, it is contagious. It's contagious, that can easily spread, that can be acquired easily. Even nowadays we are in such a pandemic situation. Since that disease is contagious, we are all afraid. So too, that fever, Tarpaulin fever, was a contagious one. And Dr. Watson nothing knows about it. And there are many problems of disease in the East. I have learned that much during my recent researches. And during this course I got this illness, he said. I'll bring Dr. Ainsley then. Somehow he couldn't stop his leg. He somehow wants to help Sherlock Holmes. Saying that I'll call this doctor, that doctor, he was just rushing back to the door. Immediately Sherlock Holmes jumped out of the bed, came towards the door and bang, closed the door, came back to the bed, motionless. So that much, if I want to have the key by force from me, Watson, be there till 6 o'clock. It's 4 now. Sherlock Holmes asks Dr. Watson to stay there till 6 o'clock. For about 2 hours, Dr. Watson has to be there. This is madness, Holmes. Only 2 hours, Watson. Then Sherlock Holmes says, it's only 2 hours. Wait. Read some books there. And he settled down there. There are pictures there. Looking at the pictures, he couldn't just sit there. He was just all the time looking at the watch. And he just observed the bench. There was a black ivory box. And he was just about to touch the box. He was holding it in his hand. Then immediately he heard Sherlock Holmes shout, don't touch. Put it down at once. I hate to have my things touched. This is a very beautiful sentence. I hate to have my things touched. Even you can use in your own everyday situation. If your brother or sister, someone touches your book, your mobile phone, you can immediately yell at them. I hate to have my things touched. Sit down, man, and let me have my rest. Only if Dr. Watson sits quietly, Sherlock Holmes would have his rest. Otherwise, he would be just observing what Watson does. And what happens furthermore, It was about 6. Then I sat in silent dejection until the stipulated time had passed. Now, Watson, he said. Sherlock Holmes asks for some change. What sort of change? Coins. If you have any, and he wanted him to place some of the letters and papers there on the table within his hand's reach. In the sense, as if he was reading something and as if he was going through something. That was the situation. And that ivory box, it has to be kept on the table with the tongues. Tongues in the sense, something we used for cooking. The tool that we use for cooking. It will be a leaf type shape. Maybe for preparing puri or chapati, we just turn, or sometimes we take and keep the dishes on the plate. There we use tongues. So with that tongues, he has to gently slide open the lid of that ivory box. Everything has a reason, my dear children. Sherlock Holmes is a detective, and if you might have went through his detective novels or movies, you would know how particular he is in doing certain actions. Certain things he was so particular in doing, and one among them is all these things. So what are kept on the table? A gas light half lit and some letters and papers there on the table, and that ivory box has to be opened not with the hand. With the tongues it has to be opened slightly. Good. Now you can go and fetch Mr. Culverton Smith of 13th Lower Burke Street. Who is this Culverton Smith? Does he know who Dr. Watson know about him? Let's see. I was hesitant to leave him now. He was delirious. I have never heard the name, I said. Well, he is a man who has the knowledge of this disease. But he is not a medical man. He is a planter. He lives in Sumatra. Have you heard of this name Sumatra? Yes, from there only he received this disease. And so, it's good to call Culverton Smith. And this is what is going on. You have to persuade him to come. That's what he says. I will bring a cab and I will ask him to come. The moment he says, then Sherlock Holmes very clearly says, just tell him how I am. I am dying. For about 3 days I didn't eat anything. And I won't last another day. You have to exactly tell my situation clearly to him. And that if he says no, you should not just leave him. You have to actually persuade him to come. So clearly Sherlock Holmes says, and thus Dr. Watson goes there. As he goes downstairs, he meets Inspector Morton. Everyone has a minor role and a major character in this story. So far we have come across how many characters? The first thing, Mrs. Hudson, the landlady of Sherlock Holmes, and then Dr. Watson, the assistant of Sherlock Holmes, then the main character, Sherlock Holmes, and then we came to know about Culverton Smith, and then now Inspector Morton. These are the characters, and each one of them has a peculiar role to play in this lesson. So listen carefully. He was not in his uniform. Who? The inspector was not in his uniform. So there is something fishy. Something is going to happen. How is he? Inspector asked. And Dr. Watson said, he is very ill. Then he reached. Who? Dr. Watson reached Culverton Smith's house. And there the butler approached him. And from the inside of the house, he heard a voice. Dr. Watson heard a voice. Tell him I am not at home. So this man who lives in Sumatra has come now to London. How does Sherlock Holmes came to know that he has come to London? Because he was there on the bed for 3 days. And how does he know that he lives in Sumatra? All these are interesting questions we should have. And then Dr. Watson just didn't keep quiet. He just pushed the butler out and entered there. I am sorry, sir, but the matter cannot be delayed. Mr. Sherlock Holmes, he just drags. The moment he heard of Sherlock Holmes' name, there is something strange in his face. He is very ill. That's what Dr. Watson said. He explained all that he has seen in Sherlock Holmes. And why should I come? And Dr. Watson says, it's because of some Eastern disease. And Sherlock Holmes says, only you can cure him. Then he persuades him to come. And before that, it was an order from Sherlock Holmes. You don't just come with him. You just reach the house before he comes, saying that you have some other appointment. You have to come and meet me. Then, as Sherlock Holmes said, Dr. Watson went to Sherlock Holmes' room before Culverton Smith could approach there, and informed Sherlock Holmes that Culverton Smith is coming. Then immediately Sherlock Holmes said, "Well done, Watson. You have done everything as a good friend can do to me. Now you go and hide yourself in the neighboring room. Should not speak anything, should not come out until I say." This was a strict order from Sherlock Holmes to Dr. Watson. Then he heard the footsteps. All these I would speak about Dr. Watson. "Holmes, Holmes, can you hear me? Whose voice is this?" This is actually Culverton Smith's voice. "Is that you, Mr. Smith?" Holmes whispered, in the sense said in a lower voice, because he was dying. He is very sick, and you know what's wrong with me. You are the only one in London who can cure me. Who says? Sherlock Holmes says. "Do you know the symptoms?" asked Smith. "Only too well, Mr. Smith." And he described the symptoms. What are they? He was not able to eat anything. He was so much feverish. His health is going day by day, very low. And thus, he could not live for one more day. To that much level, his health has gone down. Poor Victor was a dead man on the fourth day, a strong and healthy young man. What a coincidence indeed, Mr. Smith says. And they are the same. Who is Victor? And how did he die? And what is the connection Sherlock Holmes has with Victor? Let's see. "I know that you did it, Holmes." And Sherlock Holmes says clearly, "I know that you did it." "Well, you can't prove it." "Give me water, please," Holmes groaned. "Here," I heard Smith's voice. "Cure me, please." "Well, about Victor Savage's death, you did it. I'll forget everything. But cure me. I'll forget about it." "You can forget or remember just as you like. It doesn't matter to me how my nephew died." Watson said, "You got it from the Chinese sailor. There be any other reason?" "I can't think. My mind is gone. Help me," pleaded Holmes. See, this word pleaded is much more than begging. It's much more than asking. It's much more than requesting. So down to the ground, Sherlock Holmes asks. He pleads. So what's actually going on? Can you just guess? Sherlock Holmes is a detective. He's a man who detects things. There was a death instance. Who? Victor Savage actually died. Who is Victor Savage? Culverton Smith's nephew. And Culverton Smith actually killed his nephew, Victor Savage. And he was enquiring all those things. And he was dealing with the case. And Sherlock Holmes came to know all that incidences took place in Victor Savage's death. And thus he is saying, "I got it from a Chinese soldier." Which one? The disease. From Sumatra, tarpaulin fever. The same fever Victor Savage also had. With the same fever only, he is also now suffering. So what is happening? Who is the reason for it? That we will see later. But then, now he knows about the disease. Who? Culverton Smith knows about the disease. If he really likes, he could save Sherlock Holmes. And that's what he says. "I'll forget about everything. I'll just drop the case. You just please cure me." Well, you can remember it or not. You can't prove that I only killed. Yes, I only killed Victor Savage, but you can't prove it, no? Do you know anything from where you got that disease? Did anything come by post? A box by chance on Wednesday? Do you remember which box? It's the ivory box, which Sherlock Holmes asked Dr. Watson to keep it on the table. "Yes, I opened it and there was a sharp string inside. A joke perhaps. It drew blood," said Holmes. "No, it was not a joke, you fool. You've got it. Who asked you to cross my path?" You knew too much about Victor's death. Your end is near, Holmes. I'll carry this box in my pocket, the last piece of evidence. That's it. What was that last piece of evidence? It's the ivory box. So, he fixed something there in that box which could actually cut his finger. It will take blood, and from there the disease has come. So tactfully this man has planned. This man who Culverton Smith sent the parcel to Sherlock Holmes, and he opened it. As he opens, there was a joke. Perhaps something just comes up or bursts something, but then there was a small sting that he cut his thumb. From there he got the disease. Now everything is so clear. Why Sherlock Holmes is dying, and why Culverton Smith came there all the way from Sumatra to London, and why Sherlock Holmes asked Dr. Watson to call. Everything is now so clear. And Holmes asks Smith to just turn up the gaslight. Yes, I will, so that I can see you better. Culverton Smith now was so happy. He killed Victor Savage, and he also is going to kill Sherlock Holmes, who knows about the death. Now he is so relieved, and thus he just lit the gas lamp. What's all this? Successful acting, said Holmes. For 3 days I didn't taste anything, neither food nor drink, and there were footsteps outside, and it was Inspector Morton's voice. I arrest you on charge of murder, he said. If so, let me bring Sir Japper Meek or Spencer Fisher or Holmes. There was a sudden rustle and scuffle, followed by the clash of iron and sudden cry of pain. There was a click of handcuffs. Sherlock Holmes asked Dr. Watson just to come out. Sorry, Watson, I was rude to you. I undermined capability as a doctor. It was just to get Smith here, and I didn't want you to know that I was not ill. But your appearance, I said, 3 days, fasting and makeup did the trick. So what's actually happening? Sherlock Holmes was not at all sick. To be very clear, Sherlock Holmes was not at all sick. He was just acting as if he was sick. He wanted to prove that case. So he involved himself totally. 3 days he didn't eat anything. He didn't taste anything. And he did some sort of makeup that to make him so ill and he was about to die. All those things perfectly worked, and now everything is so clear. He has an evidence. Who is that? Dr. Watson. Because Culverton Smith said everything on his own. Mr. Morton was just standing outside for the signal. What was the signal? The lighting of gas lamp. The gas lamp was half lit, and once the gas lamp was fully lit, there was a brightness in the room, and that was the signal to Inspector Morton, and he came, arrested him. And furthermore, the coins, he asked. Who? Dr. Watson. Oh, that was only to prove that I was delirious. He laughed. I need to eat now, Watson. Mr. Smith killed his nephew, and he wanted to kill me the same way, to avoid imprisonment. I need to eat now, Watson. I think that something nutritious, Simpsons be out of place. And thank you, Watson, he said. And what's all these? We have so many characters. If you are too much confused, I think this revision would make you clear. Mr. Sherlock Holmes was not at all sick. He was just acting that he was sick. And thus, Mrs. Hudson came to know that he was not at all eating anything. On care, in affection, she called Dr. Watson. And Dr. Watson came. What need shall I do? And Sherlock Holmes asked him to just arrange everything on the table. And Dr. Watson was about to open the ivory box. He said, don't open, just keep it as it is. And just slightly open the lid of it with the tongues. Don't touch with your hand. So clearly he says. And he was examining a case. And he pretended as if he got the disease from there. Where? From Sumatra. What is the name of the disease? That is tarpaulin fever, or in other words, black Formosa plague. And thus, 4th day you would die if you get the disease. He was acting. Wednesday afternoon he went to bed and he was acting as if he would die on the fourth day. Successful acting. That's what at the end he says. What's the matter with Calvert and Smith and Sherlock Holmes? Calvert and Smith killed his nephew Victor Savage, and thus he came to know, Sherlock Holmes came to know about the death, everything that he only killed. And how this is not given in the textbook, it's just extra reading would make you understand. And how Sherlock Holmes knew this box is from Calvert and Smith, and how he was alert not to open the box. Because as he was examining Victor Savage's house, there he found an ivory box of same kind. And thus, while examining his death, Victor Savage's death, he found a mark, a cut mark in the thumb of Victor Savage that nobody noticed. And what was wrong with Victor Savage and Calvert and Smith? Calvert and Smith was a planter. He was illegally examining certain viruses into the plants, and thus he would take them into human beings. That was a hidden truth. That's the understanding we come into. And Victor Savage came to know about Smith's activity, and thus Smith killed Victor Savage. All these now Sherlock Holmes also knew. Because of the same way he wanted to kill Sherlock Holmes, and Sherlock Holmes was very alert. With his clear mind, he actually cunningly caught Calvert and Smith. That's a lesson we have to learn. What is the lesson? We have to be very alert in all the situations. Thank you.